Okay, so Nick, thank you for being here. I am Lucimara Letelier, a researcher in regenerative museums practices, and I'm the University of Leicester Museum Studies researcher and in Green Museum specialism. I'm interviewing today Nick Merriman, and he is the English Heritage Chief Executive, but he's here as an editor of the book Museums and the Climate Crisis, and will reflect with us on regenerative museums. So just want to know before we start that you have seen all the privacy notice and all the information and you have given consent for this research, right?
Yes, that's absolutely fine.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So Nick, you have seen the background material. Regenerative thinking, it's a lot about bringing a theory of change that it's not new. It's part of the nature. But in order to bring this to our practices, in our work in institutions, we need to systematize it. And some regenerative authors, they have done this on the 20 to 30 years in terms of thinking how we can go beyond sustainability and perhaps enter into restoration reconciliation. They're also thinking of reversing climate and social collapse if it's still possible. But the main idea is to stabilize places to design sustainable futures in a different way. And this research is focused on looking on how regenerative thinking can be applied to museums. So I would start just by looking at your conclusion on your article in the book, Museums and Climate Crisis. When you mention a new ethical museum ecology, what do you mean by this?
Well, it's an approach to museums that I suppose, although I didn't articulate it in this way, it does embrace regenerative thinking. In other words, it looks at, if we see the purpose of museums as taking a really long-term view, this was obviously why I wrote the book, because museums are some of the few organizations that are mandated to take a long-term view, hundreds of years potentially, both in the past and into the future. And in relation to the climate and biodiversity crises, it seems to me we need an entirely new museum paradigm that is not based on growth. And as you know, all the metrics for success in the museum profession tend to be based on growth of income, growth of audiences, growth of buildings and infrastructure, growth of collections, and so on. And so museum practice is inherently unsustainable. I think what your project and challenge asks is whether museums can move beyond a sustainable ecology to a regenerative ecology. And I think that's exactly the right question to ask. And I suppose where my book, the introduction, ends about that ecology, museum ecology, the regenerative thinking takes up that challenge in a really productive and concrete way.
Perfect. And I see this integration. It's really good that you address this. On your article also, you mentioned the whole notion of separation between nature and culture, which I think it's essential. It's the central point. So do you think that this reflects the separation of nature and humans in society, which, I mean, let me just rephrase it. When you mentioned the separation of nature and culture, this kind of reflects the separation of nature and humans in society, which has been intensified since the Industrial Revolution. In what ways do you think that narratives in museums can be reversed?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's inherent in the actual physical structures of museums. So most museums tend to be of human culture and human history, usually with very little reference to nature, or even of the exploitation of nature to produce the natural materials that make the objects that we see in human history and human culture museums. There's very few natural history museums, and those that are tend to separate nature from humans themselves. And even when we have an overall sort of integrated museum of a place, it has separate nature galleries and separate culture galleries where, you know, usually there's not a lot of it interlinking. So in an ideal scenario, we'd completely re-display all of our museums so that they place humans within nature, and human activity and impact on nature as being the central story, whether it's the, as I say, the exploitation of tropical forests for wood to make artifacts and so on. And I think there's a really interesting challenge. Museums are always seen as being for people, but it's very rare that I ever think I've ever heard museum people talking about museums being about other creatures and organisms with whom we share the planet. In other words, the rights of rivers, animals, and so on, to be participants, stakeholders in museum work. And that's quite a radical thought, but the thought experiment must be, I think, part of regenerative thinking. And I think that would be a really interesting idea to pursue.
I think it's so great that you mentioned this. This research is interviewing two museums, the Amazon Eco Museum and the Tanzania Museum in Kenya. They are both working for nature, to nature, and with nature. So the collections is the rivers, the birds, the trees, and there's a whole understanding that they are there to restore, to reconcile, but also to bring the visitors to understand that they are nature. So I think it's interesting and worth, if you want to look, and I can share just some ideas. There are others, but I think this is an interesting idea.
Yeah,
It's the whole notion of the eco museum concept.
Exactly. And if we begin to think of nature having rights, then I think that changes our thinking about how we even approach museums, not from a solely human-centered point of view.
I think you are entering my next question, because you actually says, and I want to bring this phrase, the historic nature and culture divide has affected all areas of museology, including the physical structures and museums, different paradigms of thinking between humanities and scientific disciplines, leading to a blind spot in museological thinking that it's the only recently being addressed. So regenerative thinkers and practitioners, they believe that incorporating living systems principles into our institutional planning, our strategic thinking, can help organizations to prioritize nature and balance social and ecological issues. The goal is to use design methods that incorporate the nature voice into a more holistic process and recognize nature as an essential stakeholder in the project. This can sound a little bit too holistic or difficult to understand, but there are proper frameworks when you are doing an annual plan and strategic thinking, and you have nature as one of the stakeholders in the table with the museum's professionals. So what potential could that perspective bring to the museum sector? And how do you think this could impact to help with this blind spot on the museological thinking?
Well, I think it potentially overturns, 4 centuries or more of museum thinking, by which have always been dominated by humans and from an extractive and exploitative paradigm, to one in which, by placing nature at the center as the stakeholder, really inverts the sort of pyramid of thinking and goals and objectives for museums. So I feel really excited about it. It's not something that I've, it's only recently impinged on my own thinking. I guess, as you pointed out in my introduction to the recent edited volume, I kind of pointed out the blind spot. I didn't really delve into ways in which it could be addressed and mitigated. And I think you're offering a really productive and exciting way forward in developing our thinking further.
Yeah, and of course, because the literature is very limited in terms of the crossing over between regeneration and museums, the idea of the report is that the museum's professionals can have access to the existing literature on regeneration and take the advantage of this to then transform to frameworks that can be tailor-made to museums. I think it's the beginning of the process, but this research can definitely help. So let's talk about, I think this phrase that you bring, it's really good in terms of create a new vision for museums. So you say you need a new vision for museums, that it's carbon and pollution neutral, more diverse, and based on reward metrics other than growth alone. So let's talk about the notion of growth. As you know, regenerative thinkers, they criticize or they have arguments in relation to the sustainable development because the economic growth equations is still there.
Yeah.
And I think I want to just bring here some ideas when they say that, yes, the sustainable development is trying to do less bad and doing more good, which is good. It's half of the way there. It's an important step, but we need to go beyond that because maybe when we're thinking about the biosphere health, we may need degrowth. And regenerative thinking cultures, they pursue this belief. It's a time to committing also to restoring, to regenerating life where damage has gone too far. So I think you have gone through this already, but when we're shaping this new vision for museums, could perhaps the regenerative thinking help us to reflect about how we face the social and climate collapse, but also minding the growth in museums?
Yes, it can do, I think, because regenerative thinking, from what it's my understanding is relatively superficial, but it actually offers quite a positive framework forward. So I think in museums and all sorts of other areas of life, the concept of degrowth is probably quite difficult for many of them because so many museums, although they take a long-term perspective in theory, most of their goals are fairly short-term. And the idea of kind of doing less, having less money, fewer visitors, etc., all seems kind of quite difficult. Whereas if you replace that with a positive paradigm of regeneration and regenerative thinking, it's not growth, but it gives another sort of positive framework of action. So I think, degrowth, it's the D word. It means sort of stopping doing something. It can feel quite negative, stepping back. Whereas regenerative, even just the word, but also the actions behind it, feel positive and forward-looking in a way that I think will be much more acceptable particularly to museum boards, who are ultimately the ones who kind of constrain thinking because they set the targets for the executive. And I think actually not enough thinking is given to museum governance structures in effecting change. Often it can be sort of we're exhorting the directors of museums or the staff of museums to do things. It needs the board or whoever is kind of responsible for the museum absolutely to take hold of this. Otherwise, an enthusiastic staff won't be able to get anywhere. So I think regenerative thinking is a really positive framework to allow that to happen.
I think it's very interesting that you reach to a point of the positive, the optimist, because I have seen a lot of discussions in museums in relation to reimagine museums, the whole idea of reimagination and the fact that we need to create a new type of hope. And I have been in the center of these discussions in other types of organizations, NGOs, universities, because the transition movement to think about more positively about the future is not something that is just the museum seeking this. Of course, we are all seeking this. And I think I would just remember by hearing you, and I think this is so interesting, the idea of creating a positive narrative, because this might reflect on positive narratives in the museum's exhibitions as well, in a different way of framing how we talk to the public. And I want to bring one thinker on the regenerative movement, who is Joanna Macy. I don't know if you have heard of her, but she talks a lot about the idea of the deep ecology to help us to create a new positive way forward. But she talks about active hope, the whole notion that we hope by doing change, we hope by interfering in the future positively. But in order to do this, we need to deeply understand the sorrow of the earth. We need to understand where we are, which is collapse, but then we move on and then we create something new and inspiring for us. So I'm really, really very, I don't know if you have any other reactions to this, but I just want to bring this, I don't know if you have heard of Reinventing Organizations from Frederic Laloux.
I've heard it, yes.
He worked for many years at McKinsey Company, but he left, and he's creating a whole idea of how the organizations are co-evolutionary entities with Earth and others to co-create a new way of thinking, but understanding and compromising to where we are. because we are institutions that hold a mindset that it's so hard to change and has been so much driven by Anthropocene. So how do we then bring this knowledge by understanding that we are creating a different hope, but yes, driving a positive future and demonstrate where we can go together. So just telling you a little bit of how these other authors inform the regenerative thinking, even if it's not only the environmental sides, there's other people from the management systems also informing regenerative thinking. I don't know, have you heard of some of these ideas?
A little bit, but not in detail. But it's really interesting. I think my one comment, sort of in reaction to that, is that in thinking about my book, clearly a lot of museum people think about their organizations and what their organizations can do internally, you know, to reduce their carbon footprint and all that sort of stuff. I think we have to realize that that's all very good because, you know, we have trusted status, we are seen as exemplars of good practice and that sort of thing, but that doesn't make much difference in itself because the museum sector is quite small. So the real focus must be on the impact we make in the world, and therefore how we can engage actually very large global publics in these regenerative ideas, in the idea of active hope. And as you know, the only way forward for museums in terms of their engagement with the public is that positive stories, because the doom and gloom we know from research sort of turns people off and people put their head in the sand, whereas multiple millions of people taking small actions with active hope can begin to make a difference, and also they can be active advocates for change, because it's really at the political and business level that change really has to be implemented. Museums themselves are kind of vehicles for encouraging that change, I think.
I think, yeah, a little bit further, I had a question about this, which is basically what you were saying. Can regenerative thinking drives a new generation of regenerators? Because we are just the conveyors, we are just a medium between nature and the visitors to create more awareness. But in fact, how we learn to act regeneratively ourselves, and then the museums may become regeneratively, and then society may become regeneratively, which is the ultimate aim, and not easy task. But I think you went in the critical spot, which is how do we do this?
Sure.
They were trying to learn. I want to bring a reflection on the degrowth, another layer of the degrowth, because I think an earlier article that you did on dynamic collections, it's so important about degrowth. And I want to bring this notion of, let me just recap here, when you say, so the idea, the notion of degrowth, it's a lot about the commons. So regenerative thinking talks a lot about the commons. And when you think about the commons in museums, your article mentioned the notion of redistributing the collections, reflect on how the accessioning includes decolonization, repatriation, restitution, reparation. I want to pause here just to think about a reflection of the Golden Medal of RIBA this year. She ran for the award of the Architect of the Year, and she won. Leslie Loco, she said decolonization and decarbonization are two sides of the same coin. And so I want to ask you your thoughts on this, because how does that inspire the integration between social and environmental actions in museums that have been usually so much separately developed in museums?
Yeah, that's something I've sort of struggled with myself, but I think museums are fundamentally about collections, aren't they? Because, you know, without the collection, the museum doesn't really exist. And, you know, it's not the only thing by any means, but, you know, a lot of museum programming, thinking must derive from its collection. And kind of as we've discussed, collections are usually considered completely separately from the contexts in which they were made, acquired, traveled, etc. And again, in the introduction to my book, I talk about ways in which we might be able to think of those interconnecting webs that link our collections with global processes of empire, slavery, biodiversity loss, exploitation, and the beginning of the climate crisis. So I've already mentioned, you know, mahogany wood that is cut down in the Caribbean, exported to England to be made into furniture in fine houses. Those deforested areas then used as sugar plantations, which with slaves from Africa, that sugar providing wealth, and also this, you know, all of the material culture around sweeteners, tea, etc., etc. You can almost any museum object from the 19th century, probably across the world, can be linked to these global currents, but we tend to explore often just a local or a national story that is imprisoned within the context of a particular discipline, be it art history or cultural history or natural history, for example. And the problem, of course, is that objects are concrete and three-dimensional in specific spaces, so it's quite difficult to tell interweaving stories. But with digital technology, with human explainers, with a different approach to presentation, we can begin to break down those barriers. So that's a long-winded way of saying, if we focus on a new approach to our collections, we can absolutely make clear that proposition that decolonization and decarbonization have to be sides of the same coin. And there's a way of thinking about museums as well. There's a very nice example. One of the few museums in the UK that has styled itself in the past as an eco museum is the Iron Bridge Gorge Museum. It's a museum in a landscape, essentially, that has always told the story of the Industrial Revolution. It's also possible to see that museum as the museum of the Anthropocene and the beginning of the climate crisis, because it's where, you know, they say it's where the Industrial Revolution started. So we can begin to just reframe our existing assets. It's the interpretation that we need to work on. You know, we've got the assets there to tell these interlinked stories, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because just by seeing it all together, it reframes our interpretation in museums, and maybe we can help society to see it again as something together. So when we talk about the notion of climate injustice or environmental racism, if we talk about those things throughout the collections, it's a high potential narrative. So then we enter in a learning process between museums and visitors on how we understand these issues, because it's so concrete in the material culture. So we can learn from this. It can inform us. Yeah, thank you for this. I want to go deeper on this notion of that we're talking about, just thinking about place. Regenerative thinking, it's a lot about regenerating places. The notion of place for me in museums can be expanded. So a lot of regenerative thinkers have developed practices of urban redevelopment or cities or neighborhoods, which is very much geographic location based. But I think museums, we can go beyond that. So you mentioned on your recent Julius Bicycle interview that the Horniman's mission has been changed, and it has become better aligned with its climate and ecology manifesto and emergency declaration, which is great. This includes two important directions. One that considers the local territory in the southeast of London, which includes a concern about a well-being of a very diverse audience of 18% BAME. Great. This is geographic location. The second one considers global issues, such as the climate impact or the commitment to return the Benin bronzes to Nigeria, which is a second notion of place for museums. And I want to bring this idea because place can mean different things in the museum's context. I want to bring a quote of regenerate thinking to help us. Regenerative culture believes that if we want to regenerate the planet, we need to do it place by place. They believe regeneration can happen when the essence of the project or the institution meets the potential of a place. So I want to ask you, what role do you believe museums can play in expressing their care and potential ability to transform places for more sustainable futures when we expand this notion of what places can we care for as museums?
Mm. No, I think it's a really interesting point. Obviously, museums and their collections are very different, but so a museum like the Horniman, as you know, has a global collection. So most of it's sort of anthropology and natural history. So while there is a very kind of small local natural history collection that was collected, not far, nearly every object in the Horniman is associated with a different country, a different place. And in thinking about, for example, research and partnership working, it was very much driven by not, for example, developing partnerships in the Gulf or in China, which is where a lot of potential resources lie in terms of museum development and consultancy. But we prioritize partnerships with countries and places from which the collection derived. That includes Nigeria, but also Kenya and all sorts of different places. So I think, and even a museum, as I said, that is kind of predominantly sees itself as of local history, the objects within it, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, will be made of materials from all over the world, which have got there through the currents of empire. So even the most local seeming museum has a global connection. So I think if we are to really begin to reconceptualize museums and their potential impact through this regenerative framework of thinking, we should exactly be seeing museums as local and global. I mean, at the Horniman, I always said, a lot of old phrases are really good. Think global, act local, or think local, act global. You can kind of do all of these things. So the worst thinking for museums would be entirely parochial and local, because that wouldn't do justice to the very widespread networks that are encapsulated in museum collections. But of course, I think the other thing is that places are about physical things on the ground, nature, but they're also about people. And so I think when we shouldn't distinguish between people and place. Museums will always want to engage with the people in a particular place in different parts of the world, as well as perhaps develop regenerative projects within the landscape and the environment.
Yes, and also I was going to ask you, of course, reparation, restitution of objects, it's a very complex issue, but would you think that the how the how we do it could then inform regenerative practices or restoration in the place of this object belong to? And I'm gonna add some point about this. Regenerative thinkers understand that there's always a bioculture story that the people in the community holds. And you mentioned this when you mentioned the objects are not isolated from this culture. But we don't know, perhaps, what is the bioculture constitutions of this object in its orange. And when we bring back to a new context, back to this context, we are also restoring some kind of equilibrium that was dysfunctional because of the absence of this object. So do you think that the how we do it can inform us on regenerative practice on reparation and restitution of objects?
Yeah, I very much hope so. And you've waved a book. I'm going to wave a book as well, which is the just another book I've recently written on the return of the Benin bronzes at the Horniman as a case study. And I think I set out there how we went about the process of a dialogue with Nigerian colleagues, which ended in it's the transfer of title of the objects, and that was the most important thing. A lot of the objects are still in the Horniman, but they're owned by Nigeria. A small number have gone back, and the others, they may go back in the future. But I think the process was an important one, because it actually was one of those rare so-called win-win situations, whereby we consulted with a large range of stakeholders locally, and with the Nigerian diaspora in London, and with Nigerians in Nigeria, and with local school children who were studying ancient Benin as part of their curriculum, and so on. And essentially, there was universal consensus that morally and ethically the right thing was to return. And that then allowed us to make a case to our regulator, which is called the Charity Commission, who agreed with our trustees' decision to return on moral grounds, in that they had been definitely looted. Now, as you said, all restitution cases are different, you know, so it's very difficult to generalize, but you're right, you can generalize about a process. And that process involves, of course, multiple voices, mutual respect, goodwill and collaboration, with a strong moral and ethical framework within which to come to a decision. So yeah, I mean, what we didn't do, I suppose, with the Benin thing with Nigeria, was think about it in terms of regenerative thinking. It was more about, if you want to call it, restorative justice, because it was recognizing, as you absolutely say, there was an absence. And actually, one of the most important things that the people we consulted with was simply that they hadn't been listened to. I mean, you know, requests for the return of the Benin bronzes had been going on since before the Second World War, but no action. So the fact that we actually listened and did something was remarkably important. And as I said, it was the signing a piece of paper that transferred ownership, which was the really important thing, saying we'd recognized that a wrong had been done. Most of the objects are still in the Horniman on loan, so that people can see them. So it's kind of worked to both parties' satisfaction.
If I may, I was thinking on bringing a regenerative lens on this situation, because you mentioned was based on restorative justice and not necessarily on regenerative practices. But when we look at the 7 principles of regeneration, regenerative development, if you think about this project had the whole idea of holiness, which is one part has been missing from the whole, and you gave this back. The second is developmental. It means that there is a co-evolutionary process that we all learn, it never ends. So in the terms that the museum professionals learn something, the community of Nigeria in London learn something, and they also learn something, there is a co-development. The other one is the essence and the place. This place met the essence of the Horniman, and together they make something which is not problem solving. It's rising the potential of this place. The other one is nodal intervention. Is the fact that you identify one action that can create a nested effect, which is the fact that you are discussing the exploitation between humans and nature all together, and reversing this thinking by doing one nodal intervention that has a scale and impact that it's such an important one. The other one is a reciprocity. It means that both Nigeria community here and Nigeria community there were involved, and also the mutual learning between the institutions from the Horniman and Nigeria. So I just did an exercise, very quick exercise, but what if we step back and bring this framework before the action starts, and help the museums professionals to use this framework to then think about actions they can do, and how potentials they can find between their essence and the potential of the places. You could have any reflections. We also keep going to the other question, but I just felt by doing this, we could learn together how regenerative practice can inform our work in museums.
No, I think if we had that framework within which to think about the Benin return, it would have been extremely useful, because, to be frank, we were kind of making it up as we went along. You know, we sort of said, okay, we've had this request, we need to, and we had a process in our policy, but it was very much just, you know, it was very pragmatic with this sort of, I suppose, the ethical thing where we needed to do the right thing and speak to lots and lots of people. But to have this, the sort of framework you've outlined would have been tremendously useful, and I'm sure would be really useful in future thinking, not just about restitution, but also about future museum development as a whole.
I think this is a good point for us to move to the idea of the individuals who work in museums, because intuitively, you develop a regenerative way of doing things by acting in this specific case, but we maybe have to bring museums professionals to enter to this development of a new knowledge. So this could become part of what we do more naturally. So I want to ask and question you about how we address this in the capacity building of museums professionals. But let me do the proper question. You have previously mentioned the importance of museums to engage the public as active citizens. Some authors argue that for institutions to reach this goal, they need to focus on the individual's own personal development first. They suggest that those in charge of institutions must commit to evolve their own social, humanitarian, and eco-literacy, eco-capacity in order to effectively lead these institutions towards playing a crucial role in addressing social and environmental justice issues. What are your thoughts about this perspective being applied to the museum's workforce? And what tools would be helpful for museums to develop a leadership or regenerative leadership in this direction?
Yeah, I think absolutely it is needed. I think many museums are already taking simple steps, such as carbon literacy programs, because there is already a sort of framework in the UK for doing that, but they're very practical. They're just sort of teaching people about, you know, what does decarbonisation mean and what does carbon footprint mean and all that sort of thing. What we lack is a much wider framework of positive thinking around the future of museums as social and, I suppose, environmental organizations as a whole. You're absolutely right that this has got to start with leadership as well. I think that my own observations about the history of these sort of issues in museums is that they started off being led from below by enthusiastic and committed people, but they were often rather lone voices and not much change happened until leadership began to take these seriously. And speaking from the UK, we're slowly getting to a position where museum leaders recognise that something has to be done. You may be aware that I think last October there was a UK museum COP held at Tate Modern, where essentially representatives, well, the leaders of the main sort of regional and national museums and funding bodies all agreed pretty well, overwhelmingly, to a whole series of commitments and actions in these areas, including workforce development and skills. And there's a whole series of actions, I don't know the details, I'm afraid, of what we as leaders need to be doing to develop ourselves and to develop our workforce. It's still pretty much on a skills basis. So I think there would be, what I would love to see is a kind of climate leadership or regenerative museum leadership college. You know, a series, you know, it could be action learning sets, could be a cohort with some sort of curriculum content, you know, for a week or two's residency to develop a new generation of regenerative museum leaders. That would be, I mean, and that would need funding, of course, but some funding bodies like Arts Council, who are very committed, of course, one of their 4 goals being environmental, they might be interested in discussing something like that. So I think it's multifaceted. You're absolutely right. It's leadership, but it's also the staff. And I think it just needs to sound not too difficult and onerous and like yet another thing that has to be bolted on. I think it has to be integrated into existing development programs. So, you know, talking to the people who are leading carbon literacy and perhaps thinking about widening that might be a good way of actually getting it some traction.
I want to ask you about something about this idea of building capacity. I was responsible for the Museums Academy program at the British Council for more than 4 years, which was based on the UK knowledge in mutuality with the Brazilian knowledge, and we created this academy for 3 years. Of course, capacity building, it's essentially, and it's very important. We also did a co-curatorship with the Museum of Tomorrow for a conference that brought 400 people to think about what museums are for, and I did the curatorship for this. But going back to the regenerative capacity building, one of the ideas is that we need to be immersed in nature. We need to think less cognitively about nature and more anthroposophically way about nature, which means bringing our heart and our hands and doing regenerative learning. I'm not sure if you're aware, in the UK, there are important organizations doing this. One is the Schumacher College with Satish Kumar, who's one of the leaders of regenerative thinking, which is it's a great way of informing this. The other one is Gaia Education, which is in Finhorn Eco Village. What I mean by this is that would that be worth that we bring a more different way of capacity building, that it's not anchored in the environment of audiences and lectures or the way we have done it, but in a way that people can experience nature. And by experiencing nature, they may also reframe the way we work in museums. Would that be helpful? This is called a deep ecology, an experience of permaculture, agroforestal, and also the whole idea of bioconstruction. So all the concepts that bring us to hands-on experience, and then we can bring back to the museum's practices. Would that be helpful?
I think it would be tremendously helpful. I think it would be really inspiring. I think clearly there'd have to be a way in which people could be supported to bring it back to museums practically, because I think one thing I've observed in my own development is that one can go away and do something really inspiring, come away completely inspired and charged up, and then you hit the day job and all that effect dissipates and there's no change. So I think the entry back into the museum and implementation of what has been inspiring the individual is really important, because quite a lot of that energy sometimes is just dissipated. So there needs to be thinking about space on return to organization and not just going back to business as usual.
And you're quite right. And also translating how does it sit on our management systems and not only our individual level principles. And how do we transfer that to the way you manage organizations? And I think the regenerative practice can inform this. I want to ask you about, in your book, Richard Piacentini, the director of the FIPS Conservatory of Botanical Gardens, he does mention the regenerative frameworks being applied. I was going to ask if you are familiar with these frameworks or with how this has been applied, and maybe could that inform other museums also to use these frameworks and start trying regeneratively managing their projects?
No, it's really interesting. I wasn't aware of the frameworks until Richard applied them, and it's really interesting that until then I wasn't aware of the work of Carol Sanford, for example, and she's clearly influenced your own thinking. So I mean, Richard, okay, yes, it's a kind of botanical garden sort of and so on, but it's absolutely applicable to a museum context, I think. So what I think is really useful about those frameworks is that they can be they're very conceptual, but they can be practically applied, as Richard's own work shows. So I would welcome their sort of further tailoring for a specific museum audience.
That's good. That's good to know. But just for the sake of information, they all what they're all doing is bringing nature, as I said before, to the strategic thinking. And although there are frameworks tailor-made to specific types of the process of management, they all mind nature as one of the stakeholders. And I think that's the crucial thing of these frameworks. Well, you have this phrase that I think it's so important. You say, sleepwalking as we are into the sixth mass extinction and an overwhelming series of climate change. Museums must engage as a sector with these long-term global issues. And I think it's important when you say long-term, it's not just the crisis that will finish. So what unique contribution do you believe that only museums can offer to deal with society's denial of climate change and also the museum sector denial?
Well, as I said earlier, it's because we are mandated to take this long-term view. And I think we haven't really embraced the importance of taking that long-term view. We're some of, as you know, and as it's set out in my article, museums are highly trusted by the public. And that's very, very precious, because so many institutions have lost that trust. So we are highly trusted, we are highly expert, and we have very wide reach. So I think, for me, if you're a museum worker, there's a moral and ethical imperative for you to speak truth, academically informed truth about what is happening to the planet, because it is an existential threat to everybody. And we are kind of like, I don't know, we will be failing as organizations and as informed individuals if we don't alert people, but not through doom and gloom. That's the trouble. You know, it's no good crying wolf all the time. We have to have this very active and hopeful commitment that change, if we take the long term, we can adapt museums as exemplars of how society needs to adapt to what I think, as we're agreeing, is inevitable severe impacts of climate and biodiversity breakdown. And for my own thinking now in a heritage organization, you know, I'm thinking the heritage we have, which are mainly historic buildings and archaeological sites, the assumption about all heritage preservation, including museum collections, is that posterity, the future, is going to be kind of similar to now. We may have different clothes and different technologies, but there'll be a similar environment. We cannot assume that now. So we must, you know, if fundamentally we're there to preserve stuff for the future, as well as engage people in the present, if that future is going to be radically different and we can't even guarantee preservation, then we need to think about what does that mean, both for our paradigm and how we might adapt. You know, what might heritage and heritage values look like in 100 years' time, when we have all these huge rises in sea level, extreme weather events, possible mass movements of population. I think it's very hard for us to think that far ahead, even as people who are charged with thinking long term. And this sort of regenerative thinking challenge, I think, helps us give some of the vocabulary and grammar with which to do that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the heritage. I recently visited the Stonehenge and I was so impressed by it. And one of the things that we think on regenerative practices is the fact that ancestor knowledge can point us to future solutions. In Stonehenge, it has pointed possibilities of solutions when it thinks on a circular time, when it thinks about the whole union between humans and nature in such a sensitive way and such a very profound way. So I think it's just the seeds there for future thinking on how ancestral knowledge informs us about future solutions for a more regenerative present for a sustainable future.
Yeah,
And you're quite
absolutely.
right, heritage can point us to this. Well, Nick, it has been great, all the conversation. I just want to see if you have any final reflections. And I want to bring back your phrase that I love, which is, it's better to start the journey and be accused of being hypocritical and imperfect rather than doing nothing and waiting to be perfect. And in the recent interview, you also said, if we declare an emergency, we have to act as it is an emergency. So yes, you were the UK Museum Corp chair, and I think this was so important for the UK. But thinking about the UK and globally, do you want to reflect your final words in terms of how regenerative thinking maybe can help us to think about the emergency and going beyond the emergency on think about sustainable future in a more regenerative way? Just your final reflections, really.
Yeah, I know.
Advancements and challenges that you see.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed our discussion. You know, regenerative thinking is relatively new to me, and I think it's a really exciting and positive framework. And I think, you know, this is the constant dilemma. We need really bold and imaginative thinking. That's great, and that's where academia and academics can really help us. At the same time, that's not enough. We need action. And I think, you know, my own work has always been trying to bridge theory and action. And I think all of the work I've been doing recently, and it's why I'm excited about your work, is that it's got to be action focused. it's no good just writing an article. You've got to actually then put it into practice and make some change. And as I say, start, be imperfect, make mistakes, but just do something.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to hear also if you have any ideas of the barriers we may face to implement regenerative thinking.
Well, I think certainly in the museum sector in the UK, and I think probably around the world, people are very, very burdened by current financial and resource imperatives. So sometimes they get so blinkered because they're thinking, how can we keep the doors open? How I might need to sack some staff. And I just haven't got the space to think about the next 50 years or 100 years. So I think, yeah, practical overwhelm in the public sector and cultural sector is a real barrier. And it's a difficult one to get out of. I think I would only say to colleagues dealing with that is that sometimes the only way out of overwhelm is to take a step out and think of what is the big picture, what is the purpose of your organization. And that's when you can introduce some new thinking, which might be actually helpful in you solving what looks like an insurmountable immediate problem. Counterintuitive, sometimes step away and think long term.
Yeah, great. So think long term, but bring the quick wins for regenerative presence as well in the present moment. So thank you for your time. Appreciate your contribution. You're going to be informed about when the report has been released. This is also important for the museums community to have an understanding and access to the literature of regenerative thinkers and what's going on in the regenerative movement at the moment. I am Lucimara Letelier, Research in Regenerative Museums at the University of Leicester Museum Studies, Green Museum Specialist. And I interviewed today Nick Merriman, the editor of the book, Museums and the Climate Crisis. So before I finish here, thank you very much for your time and especially for your regenerative thinking and your work.
Thanks, Lucimara. Okay, bye.